Hi, everyone, and happy week 7. This week, we are talking about three concepts that on the surface might seem disconnected, but are actually related. And so, part of what we're going to be talking about in class this week is how these concepts are actually connected. So, for our discussion this week, we are really going to be focusing on distinguishing between voice and footing, and also understanding comma rules. And so in order to prepare for class on Wednesday, I'd like you to do two readings. The first is Performing Prose Chapter 4, which is a chapter titled From Voice to Footing. And then the second thing that I'd like you to read is a PDF that's posted in the Week 7 folder that's written by Kyofi, and it's called Punctuation Part 1, the Comma Promiscuous Uses. So our three concepts this week are really voice, footing, and the 13 comma conventions that Kyofi talks about. And those conventions we'll be talking about in more detail in class. I'm not going to go through those in the video because I would probably put you right to sleep. So what we're really going to focus on in the video is the Performing Prose chapter that's really talking about this idea of voice and footing. So let's dive into that. What Holcomb and Killingsworth are really focusing on is the idea of how metaphors about writing often are connected to metaphors about speaking. And part of this is rooted in sort of the rhetorical tradition, which started with speaking and oratory and moved into written text. And so what Holcomb and Killingsworth are thinking about is how the writer is really at the intersection of speech and writing. And so they talk about the terms of speaking and orality, which is sort of the act of responding or creating a message for an audience that is oral, or the written literacy skills that we are very familiar with as writing scholars, which is focused on communicating to others through written texts. And there's two concepts that kind of come out of this relationship between speaking, orality, and literacy and writing. And those concepts are first voice, which is what makes the writer's style unique or distinctly theirs. And also the concept of tone, which is the writer's attitude toward the subject or the audience. So we can talk about voice and tone in terms of speech, which is about, is my voice calming, or is it elevated or excited? Is my tone authoritative, or is it forceful, or is it soft and kind? So all of those kinds of descriptions of voice and tone are things that we're used to talking about with spoken conversation or spoken communication, but it also applies to written communication as well. But Holcomb and Killingsworth want to take this idea one step further. So moving beyond just voice and tone to really thinking about the idea of footing. And so instead of putting the writer in the center of this diagram, as you saw on the previous slide, they're kind of seeing it as a sort of continual, or a continuum, I guess is the right word, where a writer is orienting or positioning themselves or the text itself in relationship to the reader. So kind of when they're talking about footing, they're talking about orientation as opposed to a strict kind of voice or tone kind of understanding of how a writer is sort of positioning themselves in relationship to the reader. So there's lots of stylistic ways where we can actually see this happening. So they talk about how footing orients readers in physical space by choosing parts of speech carefully. So in previous readings, we talked about articles like using a or the, and the distinct difference that happens if you use the a article. So for example, a book or a dog versus the article with like the book or the dog, that put the article puts the reader closer to the dog or closer to the book rather than just a book, any book out there. It's this book, the dog, that's really focused in that way. So Writers can choose parts of speech carefully to think about how they want to position the reader in relationship to what's happening in the text. But it can also happen by controlling perspective and point of view. The book talks a lot about this in terms of thinking about it from almost like a film perspective. So, where is the camera focused, and how close is the camera to the action versus how far away it is? And we'll talk about this more with an example in class on Wednesday as well. So, in addition to orienting readers in physical space, footing can also orient readers in terms of rhetorical space or social space. And this is accomplished by acknowledging or creating a social standing between the writer and the reader. So being very formal, taking a formal tone, or being familiar and using a casual conversational tone. So that's one way. Also adopting social rules for the writer and assigning them to the reader. So addressing the reader directly, or sort of assuming elements of the reader and making it clear to the reader that you are assuming things about them. We sort of saw this in Ross Gay's essay when he was talking about the university and how he sort of brought us as readers in with the assumption that we were also part of a university community or culture. Also, you can orient readers in rhetorical space by the language and the word choice that you're making. So using social languages, dialects, or registers helps to create a relationship or claim identity for both the writer and for the reader as well. So we'll talk about this in more detail with a couple of examples in class on Wednesday. And as I said, we'll be really focusing on the comma conventions from the Keofi reading. You'll read about those in the reading for Wednesday, and then we'll talk about those in more detail in class on Wednesday as well. So as you read performing prose, think about how the author's discussion of voice and footing compare to what you've previously learned or assumed about voice. And then as you're reading Keofi, think about what he's listing these 13 comma rules. So were there any rules that were new or surprising to you? And then the last thing I'd like you to think about is, what connections do you see when you look at both readings? What connections do you see between the two pieces? And how might comma use actually influence a writer's voice or footing in a specific piece of writing? So that's what's on tap for the beginning of the week. And then at the end of the week, we've got discussion boards and Commonplace book number 4, both of which are due on Sunday, October 15th by 11:59 p.m. So that is the plan. And we will gather again on Wednesday. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all. And if you haven't already, please be sure to complete the check-in survey that I shared with you all last week. We'll talk about that in class on Wednesday to see if we need to make any changes to what we're doing as a class together as well. All right, I hope your week starts well, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all later this week. Bye.